question we're going to be looking at here is to examine the strengths and weaknesses of utilitarianism in part 1, and then discuss the view that the strengths outweigh the weaknesses. The big thing about this question is you are doing strengths and weaknesses in part 1, which is a bit different to what we've done before. It means you need to say a little bit more about the weaknesses, and you need to add in more detail about the weaknesses, more philosophers to do with weaknesses, and that's so definitely be prepared for that. Now, a little bit on the strengths first. You've got half of part 1 you could allocate to strengths. Firstly, you could say this is a very simple theory. It's based, and again, what evidence could you give to back that up? Well, it is based on a single principle, the principle of utility. That makes it a very simple, straightforward theory. Remember, the principle of utility, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, introduced by Bentham, Principles of Moral Legislation, 1789. Now, Bentham was proposed, another strength of Bentham's theory was that it was quite scientific. It was, by using the hedonic calculus, you could calculate in quite a scientific, mathematical way the right thing to do by looking at the amount of pleasure produced, the amount of pain produced, allocating scores using the hedonic calculus. So, using the hedonic calculus, for example, you would look at, for example, the duration of the pleasure or pain, the extent, the number of people involved, and so on. This is a naturalist theory. It's based on human nature. It's based on an idea called psychological hedonism, that all human beings seek pleasure and want to avoid pain. Now, the strength of this approach is that it's very rational. It doesn't depend on God. It avoids the problems of divine command theory. Very much based on reason. It's therefore very fair. It's because everyone feels pain and wants to avoid pleasure. And the strength of the theory is that it's quite a fair theory. It involves not being biased towards yourself or people close to you. It's quite universal. That is another strength. It's something that everybody should count equally in this theory. And it fits very well in a secular age. Utilitarianism has become a dominant approach in dealing with moral problems in modern society as religion's influence has waned. It's a very practical theory. It led in Bentham's time to real practical changes. For example, the Factory Acts of the 1830s, working conditions for the poor, lots of advantages there, and so utilitarianism has plenty of strengths. It's a simple scientific theory based on human nature. It's rational and it's fair. It's universal. It applies to everybody. It's secular and it's very practical. It's flexible and practical. That leads to the final strength. Its flexibility is very important. In, for example, telling a lie wouldn't be ruled out as being absolutely wrong if it led to the right consequences, reducing pain, for example. Then telling a white lie might be justified by utilitarianism, and that flexibility is its strength. Now, the theory also has weaknesses. Many philosophers have pointed out that that predicting the consequences is not as straightforward as one might think. For example, if you might use a theory to decide whether or not to build a motorway going through the countryside now, or not, and you could you could use the hedonic calculus to work out what to do, but of course we don't really know 50 years down the line what the impact will be of having a fast motorway running through the countryside. The advantages might seem like good ones, but in 50 years' time, can we be sure that will be the case? The issue of justice and human rights is another key one. Bentham didn't agree with the idea of human rights. He And of course this led to the criticism that individuals could be enslaved or have their rights taken away, minorities could have their rights taken away for just to keep the majority happy. And this is a real issue with utilitarianism. Likewise, rather than distributing wealth equally in society, a utilitarian approach might justify putting most of the wealth in the hands of a minority, because that'll lead to the most amount of pleasure in total. Now, the theory's also been accused of being unrealistic in the sense that it requires us to treat everybody equally. Some people think that in utilitarian philosophy it doesn't fit with the way people actually work. For example, if you are dealing with the case of the burning, who to save from the burning building, should it be the famous scientist or your mother? Many people think that you should be biased towards your family member, whereas utilitarianism is encouraging us to save the scientist, because that will be for the greater good. Now, in terms of being unrealistic, it also is also very demanding. It requires us to give money to the poor, but at all costs. This could mean we'd have to not give any Christmas presents to each other, never entertain ourselves, because money could always be spent on a better cause. Is this unrealistic? Now, many people think there's more to life than pleasure as well. The hedonic principle there, some people think is weak. For example, you could be, if you could put yourself in an experience machine, this is Robert Nozick's idea, that if you, then utilitarians would say yes, you should go into the experience machine because that's going to give you a pleasurable life. Whatever pleasures you want, you can program. Many people would say, well, actually it's better to have a less happy life, but to really live it. Putting yourself in an experience machine surely isn't right. So surely there's more to life than pleasure. Aldous Huxley explored this idea in Brave New World as well. Finally, people have questioned whether utilitarianism can deal with modern issues that we face. Some of the really important issues in modern times are to do with the environment. Now, with environmental issues to do with global warming, for example, it's very hard for utilitarianism to make a stance against these issues, because the effects of using too much petrol and so on are very uncertain, far off in the future, and using the hedonic calculus they wouldn't be taken that seriously. But of course, environmentalists would say these are the issues that dominate the moral world at the moment. Can utilitarianism actually cope with those sorts of issues, or do we need a different approach? Now, the sort of philosophers you might want to refer to here, predicting consequences, well, that's really a point that Immanuel Kant makes. Kant thinks that you can never know for sure what the consequences will be, and that's why absolute rules and duties are essential. The idea about justice and human rights, that's a point made by John Paul II. We saw that particularly in relation to the rights in issues like euthanasia, abortion. The idea of being more to life than pleasure, the experience machine, you could quote Robert Nozick there. And finally, Derek Parfit is a good one to quote for the issue about the environment. So there are the weaknesses. That's our part one. Now, do the strengths outweigh the weaknesses? Well, here I would really recommend you bring in Mill and Singer, your modern approaches to utilitarianism. You've clearly got a balance of strengths and weaknesses. Don't repeat them. But what I would focus on is, could you use Mill to address the weaknesses? So, for example, could we use rule utilitarianism or higher pleasures, particularly higher pleasures, to deal with the issue of there being more to life than pleasure? We could, when people like Nozick talk about the experience machine, we could say, well, Mill's version can get round that problem because there you've got higher pleasures. Rule utilitarianism, could that help to get round the problem of justice and human rights? You could certainly have a rule which said don't murder or don't take innocent life, and that might solve the problem. Against that, however, how do we decide on the rules? And wouldn't people be tempted to break the rules if they could get away with it? Surely the rules of rule utilitarianism are a bit unstable, particularly weak rule utilitarianism. People would break the rules when they felt like it, so it would just lapse into act utilitarianism, and that wouldn't solve the problem. So you could bring in Mill's harm principle. Mill tries to deal with the issue of the majority oppressing or enslaving the minority. Mill says it's actually better for society if individuals have freedom from the state. That could be a way of strengthening the theory. And also we've seen how Peter Singer is focused on preferences instead of pleasure, which is a bit easier to measure. That might help strengthen the theory. So you could easily argue that despite the weaknesses, modern versions or post-Bentham versions of the theory have strengthened the argument and made it workable. Then you just need to make your conclusion.